He called her replaceable, right before she walked in. The laughter came first, light and sparkling like the champagne in their crystal glasses, drifting beneath the golden glow of chandeliers that hung like constellations over the ballroom. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Brooks, one hand wrapped confidently around the waist of Vanessa Clark, his model fiancée. Her sleek silhouette draped in a crimson gown that caught every eye in the room as if she had been designed for this exact moment, for this exact kind of attention, and Daniel leaned in just enough for his voice to carry to the right people, to the investors, the colleagues, the old friends who remembered a different woman once standing beside him. And he smiled that same polished smile, the one that used to feel like home to someone else, and said, "Upgrade." Like it was a joke, like it was harmless, like it didn't echo against the marble floors with the weight of something far colder. And the crowd responded exactly how he expected, with amused nods, with raised brows, with that subtle, approving hum that follows power when it performs well in public. And no one noticed the doors at first. No one noticed the way they opened just a few inches before pausing, as if whoever stood behind them needed a second to breathe. Because outside, beyond the polished glass and curated perfection, the night air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain against concrete. And Evelyn Carter stood there, her hand resting lightly against the gentle curve beneath her coat, her fingers still, her breathing measured, as if she had practiced this moment over and over again in silence, not to prepare what she would say, but to prepare what she would not say, because inside, the music swelled, a soft jazz melody threading through conversations about stocks and acquisitions and summer homes in the Hamptons. And inside, Daniel laughed again, tilting his glass slightly as Vanessa leaned closer, whispering something that made him grin wider. But outside, Evelyn closed her eyes for just a second, just long enough to steady the tremor that tried to rise from somewhere deeper than fear, something older, something that remembered the way his voice used to sound when it said her name differently. And when she opened them again, there were no tears waiting, only a quiet clarity, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. And she stepped forward, the soft click of her heels against the marble threshold swallowed almost immediately by the noise of the room. Unnoticed at first, just another guest among many, until she wasn't, until a few heads turned, until a whisper started somewhere near the bar and moved like a ripple through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, because recognition is a strange thing. It doesn't announce itself loudly, it lingers, it spreads, it settles into the corners of a room before anyone names it. And Daniel felt it before he saw it, that shift in the air, that almost imperceptible pause in the rhythm of admiration he had so carefully orchestrated. And when he finally turned, glass still in hand, smile still in place, it faltered, just slightly, just enough, because there she was, not standing where she used to, not looking like the version of her he had rewritten in his mind, but standing still, composed, her presence quiet and unwavering, as if she had not walked into his world at all, but simply returned to her own. And for the first time that night, Daniel Brooks didn't look like the man in control of the room. He looked like someone who had just realized he might have misunderstood the story he thought he had already finished. The silence did not fall all at once. It crept in, threading itself between conversations, slipping beneath laughter, settling into the spaces where certainty used to live. And Evelyn could feel it without looking directly at anyone. The subtle shift of attention, the way a room recalibrates when something unexpected refuses to apologize for existing. And she did not rush to fill that silence. She let it breathe, let it stretch, because for years she had been the one who filled every uncomfortable gap for him, smoothing over his sharp edges, softening his tone, translating his ambition into something palatable. But not tonight. Tonight she simply stood, shoulders relaxed, chin level, her coat still wrapped around her like a quiet boundary the room could not cross. And across the marble floor Daniel's gaze locked onto her fully now, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, just staring with that familiar intensity that used to feel like focus, but now felt like calculation. Like he was trying to place her back into a version of reality, where he understood all the variables, and when he spoke her name it came out slower than before. Evelyn. As if saying it carefully might restore some kind of control, and a few nearby guests turned more openly now, whispers gaining shape, because they remembered, of course they did, They remembered the woman who used to stand beside him at events like this, the one in understated dresses, the one who smiled at the right moments, who knew when to step back and let him shine, the one who disappeared so quietly after the divorce that people had rewritten her absence as failure. And Vanessa followed his gaze with a faint tilt of her head, her expression composed, curious rather than threatened, the kind of confidence that comes from never having seen the beginning of a story, only the version presented to her, polished and selective, and she studied Evelyn for a second longer than necessary, her eyes flicking briefly to the coat, to the stillness, to something she could not quite name, before offering a small, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. And Daniel took a step forward then, just one, enough to close the distance slightly, but not enough to fully commit, as if he was testing the ground beneath him. "I did not expect to see you here," he said, and there it was. The tone, softened just enough to sound civil, but carrying that same underlying assumption that had always been there, that she existed in relation to his expectations, and Evelyn felt it, that old echo, the version of herself that used to respond quickly, to explain, to justify, to make herself smaller so the moment would pass smoothly. But that version did not move, did not speak, because she was no longer standing in that past. She was standing here, in a room filled with people who thought they understood the ending of her story, and she simply met his gaze, steady, unflinching, and for a brief second, something flickered across his face, not recognition, not yet, but something closer to uncertainty, the kind that does not belong in a man who has spent the entire evening performing certainty. And somewhere near the bar a glass clinked too loudly, breaking the tension just enough for conversations to attempt to resume, though they came back thinner, less confident, as if everyone was now listening for something else, waiting for something to happen, and Daniel cleared his throat lightly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored sleeve in a gesture so practiced it almost looked effortless. "Well," he added, glancing briefly at Vanessa before returning his attention to Evelyn, "you are welcome to stay." And the pause before the last word was small, almost invisible, but it carried weight. It carried history. It carried the same quiet condescension he had once wrapped in charm, as if he were offering her permission to exist in a space he believed he owned. And Evelyn heard it clearly, every layer of it. And yet nothing in her expression shifted, because the truth was, she had not walked in to ask for space. She had walked in already knowing she did not need his permission to take it. Vanessa was the first to move, not away, not back, but forward with a smooth, practiced grace that matched the rhythm of the room, her heels barely making a sound against the marble as she extended her hand just slightly, a gesture polished enough to appear warm, distant enough to remain guarded, and her voice, when she spoke, carried that soft brightness people learn when they are used to being admired. "It is nice to finally meet you, Evelyn," she said, as if this moment had always been inevitable, as if it belonged to her just as much as it belonged to anyone else. And Evelyn's gaze shifted to her, steady and unreadable, taking in the details without judgment, the precise tailoring of the gown, the effortless posture, the kind of confidence that had never been questioned. And for a second, a memory brushed against the edges of her mind, not sharp, not overwhelming, just there, like a reflection in glass, of another night, another dress, another version of herself standing in a similar room, smiling the same polite smile, unaware of how temporary that role had always been. And she reached out, her hand cool, her grip firm but not assertive, meeting Vanessa's exactly where it was offered. Nothing more, nothing less. "Vanessa," she replied, her voice calm, even, carrying none of the tension the room expected. And that was what unsettled them. Not anger, not bitterness, but the absence of both. Because people knew how to respond to pain, they knew how to categorize it, how to comfort it, how to dismiss it. But composure without explanation left them with nowhere to stand. And Daniel watched the exchange closely, his eyes moving between them, as if searching for something that would confirm the narrative he had built, something that would reduce this moment back into something manageable. But nothing came, because Evelyn did not perform for him anymore. She did not react in ways he could anticipate, and the silence stretched again, thinner this time, sharper, until he filled it. The only way he knew how, with a hint of humor, with that familiar edge. Vanessa and I were just talking about how quickly things change, he said, a small smile returning, controlled, deliberate. Life moves on. And there it was again, the suggestion, the quiet rewriting of history into something cleaner, something easier to present. And a few guests nodded subtly, grateful for something recognizable to hold on to. But Evelyn heard the words differently, not as a statement, but as a reminder of how much had been erased, how easily he had always moved forward without looking back. And for the first time since she walked in, her hand shifted slightly, instinctively, resting once more against her abdomen, the movement small, almost invisible beneath the fabric of her coat, but grounding, real, a quiet anchor that did not need to be seen to be understood. And she looked at him then, fully, not as someone she once loved, not as someone she had lost, but simply as a man standing in front of her, a man who had once believed he defined her worth. And she spoke, her voice soft enough that people leaned in just a fraction to catch it. Yes, she said, and the word carried more weight than anything he had said all evening. It does. And she let it rest there. No explanation, no elaboration, because the truth did not need decoration. And somewhere in the room, someone exhaled slowly, as if they had been holding their breath without realizing it. And Daniel's smile tightened, just slightly, just enough to reveal that this conversation was no longer unfolding the way he intended, because for the first time, he was not leading it. He was following it, trying to anticipate something he could not yet see. And Evelyn remained exactly where she was, still, composed, present, as if she had all the time in the world, as if she had not arrived to prove anything at all, but simply to exist in a space that no longer belonged to his version of her. The music tried to recover, slipping back into its polished rhythm as if nothing had shifted, as if the tension had not quietly rearranged the atmosphere of the entire room. But the illusion did not hold the same weight anymore, because something invisible had already cracked, and Evelyn could feel it in the way conversations resumed just a little too quickly, in the way people smiled just a little too deliberately, like actors who had missed a cue but continued the scene anyway. And she did not linger in the center of it, did not claim attention or attempt to command the space. Instead, she moved with quiet intention toward the edge of the room, her steps unhurried, her presence no less noticeable for it. And a server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, the glass catching the chandelier light in soft reflections, and she paused for a fraction of a second before taking one, more out of habit than desire, her fingers wrapping gently around the stem, grounding herself in the cool surface. And as she turned slightly, positioning herself near one of the tall windows that overlooked the city skyline, the noise of the room softened behind her, not disappearing, but fading into something distant, manageable, like a memory she no longer needed to revisit fully. And outside, the city stretched wide and indifferent, headlights tracing slow lines along wet streets, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the pavement like scattered gold. And for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to breathe without calculation, without anticipation, without preparing for the next word or the next glance. And it was in that quiet that the past slipped in, not as a storm, but as something more subtle, more insidious, like a voice she had once mistaken for her own. And she remembered another night, years ago, standing in a different ballroom, in a dress Daniel had chosen, because he had always known what looked right, what fit the image he was building, and she had stood beside him then, her hand resting lightly on his arm, listening as he spoke about projections and partnerships and future expansions, his voice confident, effortless, and every so often he would glance at her, not to include her, but to confirm that she was still there, still aligned with the version of life he was presenting. And when someone had asked her opinion, something small, something inconsequential, he had answered for her before she could speak, with a soft laugh. She trusts me to handle those things. And she had smiled, because at the time it had felt like safety, like structure, like being part of something larger than herself. And she had not noticed how easily her voice had been replaced, how naturally her presence had become decorative, until it was too late to recognize the difference between support and silence. And now, standing here, years later, the memory did not sting the way it once might have. It did not tighten her chest or cloud her vision. It simply existed, a piece of a story she no longer needed to defend or reinterpret, and behind her, footsteps approached, measured, familiar, and she did not need to turn to know it was him, because some patterns do not disappear completely. They just lose their power, and Daniel stopped a few feet away, close enough that his presence could be felt, far enough that he could still pretend this was casual, controlled, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass between them. And when he finally broke the silence, his voice was lower, stripped of its earlier performance. "You look different," he said, and the words hovered there, uncertain, as if he had not yet decided whether they were meant as a compliment or an observation. And Evelyn turned her head slightly, not fully facing him, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard, her expression calm, unchanged, and in that small, deliberate movement, there was something he could not quite name, something he had never accounted for, because she was no longer responding to him. She was simply existing beside him, untouched by the version of her he still carried. Daniel let the silence stretch after his own words, as if he expected them to settle into her, to provoke something familiar, a reaction he could recognize, categorize, control, but nothing came, and that absence unsettled him more than any argument could have, because he had always understood her through response, through the way she adjusted, softened, explained, and now there was only stillness where those patterns used to live. And Evelyn shifted her gaze back toward the city beyond the glass, the faint reflection of the ballroom lights layering over the skyline, creating a blurred overlap between two worlds that no longer belonged together. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady. "I am," she said, and the simplicity of it left no room for interpretation, no invitation for him to define what that difference meant. And Daniel exhaled lightly, almost a laugh, but not quite, his hand slipping into the pocket of his tailored jacket, a gesture that used to signal ease but now felt like an attempt to reclaim it. "You disappeared," he added, his tone shifting slightly, less polished, more probing. "No one really knew what happened to you." And there it was, the assumption again, that her absence had been something passive, something that had happened to her rather than something she had chosen. And Evelyn felt the faint echo of that old narrative press against her, the version of events he had likely told others, neat, simplified, convenient, and she turned her head just enough to look at him fully this time, her expression unchanged, but her eyes clear, grounded. "I did not disappear," she said, and the words landed differently than anything else she had spoken so far, not louder, not sharper, but firmer, anchored in something he could not dismiss. "I left." And for a brief moment, the distinction hung between them, subtle but undeniable, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest shift betraying that the conversation had moved somewhere he had not intended, because leaving implied agency, it implied choice, it implied that the story he had been telling was incomplete at best, inaccurate at worst, and he looked at her more carefully now, as if searching for signs of that past version of her, the one who would have avoided this kind of clarity, who would have softened the statement to make it easier for him to accept, but she did not, and his gaze dropped for just a second, almost instinctively, toward the line of her coat, toward the way her posture held something new, something he could not immediately define, and when his eyes lifted again, there was a flicker of curiosity beneath the surface of his composure. "And now?" he asked, the question quieter, less performative, as if he had stepped out of the role he had been playing for the room, and into something more uncertain. And Evelyn felt the question settle, felt the weight of everything it did not say, everything it assumed he had the right to know, and for a moment, she did not answer, not because she could not, but because she did not need to rush to fill the space he had created, and her hand moved again, gently, almost unconsciously, resting against her abdomen beneath the fabric, a small, private gesture that grounded her in a reality he could not yet see. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was something quieter beneath it, something resolute. "Now," she said, pausing just long enough for the word to stand on its own, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." And she let the sentence end there, without explanation, without offering him access to the details he had once taken for granted. And Daniel studied her for a second longer, as if trying to measure the distance between what he remembered and what stood in front of him now. And for the first time since she had walked in, he did not look certain of anything at all. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that alone was unfamiliar, because he had always been quick with words, quick with conclusions, quick to shape a narrative before anyone else could question it. But now there was a pause, a real one, not the polished kind he used in meetings or negotiations, but something quieter, something that suggested he was no longer entirely sure which version of the conversation he was supposed to be having. And Evelyn could feel it, not as victory, not as satisfaction, but as a shift, subtle and irreversible, like the moment a tide changes direction without announcing itself. And she turned slightly away from the window, her attention drifting back toward the room where the evening continued to unfold in careful layers of performance, where laughter had regained its volume but not its ease, where glances still flickered in her direction before quickly retreating, as if no one wanted to be caught watching too closely. And she took a small sip from the champagne glass in her hand, the taste crisp, almost sharp, grounding her in the present, in the simplicity of something real. And behind her, Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower, less certain. "You always said you wanted something quieter," he said, as if reaching for a memory he had not fully understood at the time, as if trying to connect this version of her to something he could still recognize. And Evelyn let the words settle before answering, not because she needed time, but because she no longer felt the urgency to respond on his timeline. And when she did speak, her tone remained even. "I wanted something honest," she corrected softly, and the difference between the two words lingered in the air, subtle but significant, because quiet had always been his interpretation, his way of diminishing what he did not value, while honesty had always been what she was asking for, what she had never received. And Daniel's expression shifted again, something tightening behind his eyes, not anger, not quite regret, but something closer to recognition, the uncomfortable kind that arrives too late to be useful. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the distance between them unchanged but no longer neutral. And across the room, Vanessa's gaze found them again, her posture still composed, her smile still present for those around her, but her attention clearly anchored to this quiet exchange she was not part of. And there was a flicker there, brief and controlled, of something more observant than before, as if she was beginning to understand that this was not a simple past resurfacing, not a loose end, but something more layered, something that did not fit neatly into the version of events she had been given. And Evelyn noticed it without reacting, without shifting her stance or her expression, because this moment was not about proving anything to anyone else. It never had been, and the realization settled deeper within her, steady and unshaken, that she had not come here to reclaim space. She had come here already knowing it was hers. And Daniel followed her line of sight, briefly, noticing Vanessa watching, noticing the room watching, and something in his posture straightened instinctively, the familiar reflex of returning to performance, of reasserting control in front of an audience. But it did not fully take hold, not the way it used to, because part of him remained here, caught in the quiet space between what he believed and what he was beginning to see. And Evelyn set her glass down gently on a nearby table, the soft clink barely audible, and in that small, deliberate motion, there was a sense of completion, not of the evening, not yet, but of something else, something internal, something that no longer required his acknowledgement to be real. And when she looked at him again, her gaze was calm, unguarded, and entirely her own, as if she had finally stepped out of a conversation that had never truly belonged to her in the first place. The distance between them did not close again, and that in itself became its own kind of answer, because for the first time in years, neither of them seemed inclined to force the moment into something more than what it already was. And Evelyn could feel the shift settling deeper, not just in him, but in herself, a quiet confirmation that the version of her who once waited for his reactions no longer existed in this space. And she turned slightly, her body angling away from him without hesitation, her attention drifting back toward the room as if the conversation had reached its natural end, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm finality that did not require agreement. And behind her, Daniel remained still for a fraction longer, as if deciding whether to follow, whether to continue, whether to reclaim something slipping just beyond his grasp. But the hesitation lingered too long, And in that pause, the moment passed, and Evelyn moved forward, her steps measured, steady, blending into the flow of the evening without losing her presence. And as she approached the far side of the ballroom, a few familiar faces shifted subtly, some offering polite nods, others avoiding direct eye contact, unsure how to place her now, unsure which version of the story still applied. And she acknowledged none of it beyond a slight inclination of her head, because she no longer needed their recognition to validate her place in the room, and the soft hum of conversation resumed around her, gradually stabilizing as the center of attention shifted away. Yet something remained altered beneath the surface, something unspoken that could not be entirely undone. And across the space, Vanessa watched her again, this time with less distance, her gaze more deliberate, more curious, as if she was trying to understand what had just unfolded in the absence of raised voices or visible conflict. And when Daniel finally returned to her side, there was a subtle change in his posture, one that only someone paying close attention would notice, a slight tension in his shoulders, a fraction less ease in the way he held his glass. And Vanessa's eyes flickered between him and Evelyn once more before she spoke quietly, her tone controlled but no longer purely decorative. "You did not tell me she would be here." And Daniel's response came a second too late, just enough to reveal that he had not anticipated the question. "I did not know," he said, though the certainty in his voice was thinner now, less convincing even to himself. And Vanessa studied him for a moment longer, not accusing, not confrontational, but observant, as if recalibrating something in her own understanding, before her attention returned to the room, her smile resuming for those around her, though it carried a different weight now, more measured, more aware, and Evelyn, unaware of the exact words but aware of the shift, continued forward until she reached a quieter corner near a long table lined with glassware and soft candlelight, the flickering flames casting warm reflections against polished surfaces. And she paused there, her hand once again resting lightly against her abdomen, a small, instinctive gesture that anchored her in something beyond the room, beyond the past, beyond him. And as she stood there, the noise of the evening settling into the background once more, she allowed herself a single, steady breath, not to prepare, not to brace, but simply to exist, because whatever was coming next, whatever moment had not yet revealed itself, she no longer needed to anticipate it. She was already standing in the version of her life that did not require his approval to move forward. The candlelight near the glass table flickered softly, casting warm reflections that trembled just enough to feel alive. And Evelyn stood within that quiet pocket of the room, as if she had stepped outside the rhythm of everything else, the noise, the movement, the subtle competition for attention, all of it dimmed into something distant that no longer reached her the same way. And for the first time since she arrived, there was no weight pressing against her chest, no anticipation tightening her breath, only a steady calm that settled deeper with each passing second. And her fingers rested lightly against the curve beneath her coat, not as a shield, not as a secret to hide, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something real, something that existed beyond this room and everything inside it. And the thought came to her not as a question, but as a realization that there had been a time when she would have stood here differently, when every glance, every whisper, every shift in tone would have mattered, when she would have measured herself against the people around her, against the woman standing beside him, against the version of success that had once defined her life. And she remembered it clearly, not as pain, but as contrast, the endless adjustments, the way she had learned to anticipate his expectations before he even voiced them, the way she had shaped herself into something that fit seamlessly beside him, elegant but unobtrusive, present but never central. And how easy it had been to disappear in that role without realizing it, because it had not felt like loss at the time. It had felt like alignment, like partnership, like being part of something that required her to be less so that he could be more. And the memory lingered only briefly before fading again, because it no longer held power over her. It no longer defined the space she occupied. And behind her, the evening continued to unfold, conversations rising and falling in soft waves, the occasional burst of laughter breaking through before settling back into polite murmurs. And somewhere near the center of the room, Daniel's voice resurfaced, controlled, confident, slipping back into its familiar cadence as he spoke with a group of investors, his posture restored, his gestures precise, as if the earlier moment had been nothing more than a brief interruption. And yet there was something different now, something subtle in the way people responded to him, a fraction less certainty, a flicker of curiosity that had not been there before, because the room had seen something it could not fully explain, and it lingered beneath the surface, shaping the way they listened, the way they looked, the way they recalibrated their understanding of him without ever saying it aloud. And Vanessa remained at his side, her composure intact, her presence still striking, but her attention no longer entirely anchored to him, her gaze drifting occasionally, almost unconsciously, back toward Evelyn, as if trying to reconcile what she had witnessed with the narrative she had been given. And Evelyn felt it without turning, that quiet observation, that unspoken question, and she did not respond to it, because she had nothing to prove, nothing to clarify, nothing to defend, and the realization settled deeper within her, steady and unshaken, that this moment, this entire evening, was no longer about confrontation or validation. It was simply a crossing point, a place where two versions of her life briefly overlapped before continuing in entirely different directions. And as she reached for a glass of water this time instead of champagne, the cool surface grounding her once more, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible breath, not of relief, not of release, but of quiet certainty, because whatever came next, whatever door had not yet opened, she was no longer the woman waiting on the other side of it. She was the one who had already walked through. The room shifted again, but this time it was not subtle, not a quiet ripple moving beneath the surface. It was something sharper, something that cut cleanly through the rhythm of the evening like a note played out of sequence, and it began at the entrance, where the tall doors opened once more, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself to be felt, and conversations faltered mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips, and one by one, attention turned, drawn not by noise, but by presence, the kind that does not ask to be seen yet commands it anyway. And Evelyn felt it before she saw it, that familiar shift in the air, the way a room recognizes something it cannot immediately define but instinctively respects, and her fingers stilled against the glass in her hand, her breath settling into something slower, more grounded, as if a piece of the night she had not been waiting for had finally arrived. And across the ballroom, a man stepped inside, his movements unhurried, his posture effortless in a way that suggested not confidence, but certainty, the kind that does not depend on who is watching. And he did not pause at the entrance, did not scan the room for approval. He simply walked forward, each step measured, each glance purposeful, and people made space without realizing they were doing it. Conversations quieting as he passed, attention following not out of curiosity alone, but recognition, because even those who did not know his name could feel the weight of it in the way others reacted, in the way the room itself seemed to adjust around him. And near the center, Daniel's voice trailed off mid-sentence, his expression tightening just slightly as his focus shifted, because this was not part of the script, not part of the evening he had constructed. And Vanessa followed his gaze, her composure holding, but her attention sharpening in a way that had not been there before. And Evelyn turned then, slowly, not with surprise, not with urgency, but with a quiet awareness that settled deeper into her chest. And when her eyes found him, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only recognition, steady and unspoken. And for a brief moment, the noise of the room seemed to recede entirely, leaving only the distance between them, the space he was crossing without hurry, without doubt, as if the path had already been decided long before this night began. And the closer he came, the more the room seemed to fall away from him, until the performance, the laughter, the carefully maintained illusions all faded into something secondary, something insignificant compared to the quiet gravity of his presence. And Daniel watched, his jaw set, his posture rigid now, not with confidence, but with something far less comfortable, something that did not belong to him, because this was not a moment he controlled. And for the first time that evening, the balance had shifted completely, not loudly, not forcefully, but undeniably. And when the man finally reached Evelyn, he did not look around, did not acknowledge the room or the eyes fixed on them. He looked only at her, his gaze steady, grounded, as if everything else existed somewhere beyond the edges of his awareness. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, low, carrying just enough to be heard without effort. "I was wondering how long you were going to make me wait." And there was no accusation in the words, no impatience, only a quiet familiarity that settled into the space between them as if it had always belonged there. And Evelyn felt it, not as relief, not as rescue, but as alignment, something that did not disrupt her presence, but reinforced it. And as she met his gaze, her expression softened just slightly, not in weakness, not in hesitation, but in recognition of something that did not need to be explained. And behind them, the room stood still, suspended in that single moment, because whatever story they thought they were watching had just shifted into something none of them had anticipated, and this time, no one spoke. The moment did not break with noise. It deepened with silence, the kind that settles into a room when something undeniable has just taken place, and no one is willing to be the first to acknowledge it. And Evelyn held his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, as if his presence had not disrupted her, but completed something already in motion, and the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips, not for the room, not for the audience that had now fully turned toward them, but for him, for the quiet understanding that did not need to be explained aloud. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "You are right on time," she said, and the words carried a weight that extended far beyond the surface, because they were not about the evening, not about the event, but about everything that had led to this exact moment. And the man beside her inclined his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that felt less like a greeting and more like confirmation, as if he had always known where he was supposed to be. And across the room, the shift was immediate, visible now, undeniable, because recognition had begun to ripple through the crowd, not in loud exclamations, but in the way people leaned toward one another, in the way names were whispered with a mix of certainty and disbelief. And Daniel felt it before he understood it, that subtle change in the energy around him, the way attention was no longer anchored to him, but redirected, and his gaze sharpened, narrowing slightly as he studied the man standing beside Evelyn, searching for something familiar, something he could place within his own framework of power. And when realization began to surface, it did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments, in details, in the quiet recognition of influence that extended beyond the room, beyond the event, beyond anything he had prepared for. And his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, his confidence recalibrating into something more guarded, more cautious, while Vanessa remained still beside him, her composure intact but her expression no longer neutral, because she, too, was beginning to understand that this was not a coincidence, not an interruption, but a revelation unfolding in real time. And Evelyn felt none of the urgency that filled the room, none of the need to explain or introduce or justify, because this moment did not belong to spectacle, it belonged to truth. And the man beside her turned his attention briefly toward the room, not to address it, not to claim it, but simply to acknowledge its presence before returning his gaze to her. And in that small, deliberate movement, there was a quiet shift in hierarchy, one that did not need to be announced to be understood. And when he spoke again, his tone remained calm, effortless. "I believe they have been waiting for you," he said, and the phrasing was simple. But the implication was not, because it reframed everything: the room, the event, the attention, all of it subtly redirected. And Evelyn understood immediately, not as a command, not as a suggestion, but as an invitation she had already accepted long before this night began. And she nodded once, a small, decisive motion, before stepping forward, not toward Daniel, not toward the past, but through the space that had once been defined by it. And as she moved, the room adjusted again, not resisting, not questioning, simply making way, because something had shifted beyond perception into recognition. And behind her, Daniel remained where he stood, the glass still in his hand, the performance slipping just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it, because for the first time, he was no longer the one being watched with admiration. He was the one watching, trying to understand how the story had changed without his permission. And Evelyn did not look back, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she no longer belonged to that direction at all. The movement through the room felt different now, not because the space had changed, but because the way it responded to her had. Conversations did not simply pause anymore. They shifted, turning toward her with a quiet awareness that followed each step she took beside him. And Evelyn could feel it without looking, the subtle alignment of attention, the recalibration of importance that no longer needed explanation. And the man at her side matched her pace effortlessly, not guiding, not leading, but moving in a way that suggested he had no need to control direction, because presence alone was enough. And as they approached the center of the ballroom, a figure stepped forward to meet them, a senior partner from the firm hosting the event, his posture straightening instinctively, his smile widening just a fraction too quickly. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect that had not been present in his tone earlier that evening. "We were hoping you would make it." And there it was, spoken clearly now, a name that moved through the room faster than any whisper, settling into conversations, into glances, into the silent recognition that followed. And Daniel heard it where he stood, the sound cutting cleanly through everything else, because Alexander Hayes was not a name that existed on the edges of influence. It was one that shaped it, and the realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as something heavier, something that pressed against his understanding of the room he thought he controlled. And Evelyn did not react to the name, did not shift her expression or acknowledge the ripple it created, because she had already known it, already lived within the reality it represented. And Alexander inclined his head slightly in greeting, his response measured, effortless. "I would not miss it," he said, though his gaze moved briefly toward Evelyn as he spoke, anchoring the words somewhere more specific than the event itself. And the partner followed that glance, his attention landing fully on her now, the recognition slower but no less certain, and his expression adjusted immediately, respect layering over curiosity. "And you must be," he began, leaving the sentence open just long enough to signal expectation. And Alexander did not hesitate, did not embellish, did not perform. "Evelyn Carter," he said simply, and the way he spoke her name carried no introduction, no explanation, only acknowledgement, as if the identity itself required nothing further. And the partner nodded quickly, as if that alone was sufficient, because in this room, attached to that name, it was. And Evelyn met his gaze with calm composure, offering a small, polite nod that neither diminished nor exaggerated her presence. And behind them, the room had fully shifted now, the earlier uncertainty replaced by a new understanding that moved quietly but firmly through every interaction, because this was no longer a story about an unexpected appearance. It was about a position that had never truly been lost, only unseen. And Daniel stood at a distance that suddenly felt much greater than it was, the glass in his hand forgotten, his attention fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him. And for the first time, he was not part of it, not directing it, not shaping it, but observing it from the outside, trying to reconcile the version of Evelyn he had known with the woman now being acknowledged in a way he could not replicate. And Vanessa remained beside him, her silence more telling than any question, her gaze steady as she watched the interaction, absorbing the shift without reacting, because some moments do not invite response, they demand understanding. And Evelyn stood within it all, not elevated by the attention, not changed by the recognition, but grounded in something far quieter, something that had already been built long before this room had noticed. And as she turned slightly toward Alexander again, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, it became clear that this was not a reveal for her. It was simply the moment the world around her finally caught up. There was no applause, no dramatic shift that marked the moment as complete, and that was what made it undeniable, because the room did not erupt. It recalibrated, quietly, collectively, as if everyone present understood that something more permanent than a spectacle had just taken place. And Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, untouched by the weight of attention that had now settled fully around her. And Alexander stood beside her without drawing focus to himself, his presence steady, unintrusive, as if he had no need to reinforce what was already clear. And the conversations that resumed did so differently now, no longer circling Daniel as the center, but expanding outward, shifting toward new alignments, new points of gravity, and Evelyn could feel it in the way people approached, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with a quiet respect that did not require explanation, and she responded with the same measured calm, acknowledging each greeting with a nod, a brief exchange, never lingering longer than necessary, never allowing the moment to become something performative, because this was not about reclaiming attention. It was about existing without needing it. And across the room, Daniel remained still for longer than he realized, his mind working to reconstruct a version of reality that still placed him at its center. But each attempt seemed to fall short, because nothing in front of him aligned with the narrative he had carried for so long. And when he finally moved, it was not with the same confidence he had displayed earlier, his steps slower, more deliberate, as he approached the space where Evelyn now stood, though he did not come close enough to interrupt. Not yet. And Vanessa watched him carefully, her silence now layered with something more complex than curiosity, something that suggested she, too, was reassessing the story she had accepted without question, and Evelyn noticed none of it directly, not because she was unaware, but because it no longer required her attention. And as the evening continued, the subtle lines of power within the room had shifted. Completely, not through confrontation, not through declaration, but through presence alone. And when a host approached once more, offering a quiet invitation to move toward a more private section reserved for key guests, Alexander glanced at Evelyn, not asking, not directing, simply acknowledging, and she nodded once, her decision made without hesitation, and together they stepped away from the center of the room, not retreating, not escaping, but moving forward into a space that had already been prepared for them, leaving behind the remnants of a narrative that no longer held any authority over her. And Daniel watched them go, the distance between them no longer just physical, but absolute, because for the first time, he understood something he had never considered before, that he had not lost her in a single moment, not in a single decision, but gradually, quietly, long before this night had ever begun. And that realization did not come with anger or regret. It came with something far more difficult to ignore, the understanding that there was nothing left for him to reclaim. And as Evelyn walked beside Alexander, her hand once again resting lightly against her abdomen, her steps steady, her presence unwavering, the room behind her faded into something smaller, something distant, because she had not returned to rewrite the past. She had simply walked forward into a future that no longer needed it. The quieter section of the venue felt like a different world. The noise of the ballroom softened into a distant hum, replaced by low conversations and the subtle clink of glass against polished wood, and Evelyn stepped into it without hesitation, her pace unhurried, her presence unchanged, as if she had always belonged in this space and not the one she had just left behind. And Alexander walked beside her with the same quiet certainty, not guiding, not shielding, simply there in a way that did not demand attention, yet commanded respect from those who recognized it. And a host approached once more, offering a brief greeting before stepping aside, as if even formality understood when it was no longer necessary. And Evelyn paused near a window that overlooked the city, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance like a map of lives continuing far beyond this single night. And for a moment, she allowed herself to be still, not because she needed to gather herself, but because there was nothing left to gather, nothing left unresolved within her. And Alexander stood beside her, his presence steady, his gaze moving briefly over the skyline before returning to her. And there was a quiet understanding in that look, not of rescue, not of completion, but of recognition, the kind that does not ask questions because it already knows the answers. And he spoke after a moment, his voice calm. "You handled that exactly the way I knew you would." And there was no praise in the words, no surprise, only certainty. And Evelyn exhaled softly, a breath that carried no tension, no lingering weight from the past she had just walked through. "I did not go there to prove anything," she replied, her tone even, reflective without being distant. "I just needed to see it for what it really was." And Alexander inclined his head slightly, as if that alone explained everything, because it did. And behind them, the city continued in its quiet rhythm, unaffected, constant, and Evelyn's hand moved once more to rest gently against her abdomen, the gesture no longer instinctive, but intentional now, grounding her in something far more significant than anything that had happened in that room. And she looked out at the lights for a moment longer before speaking again, her voice softer, but no less certain. "He thought I would come back to the same place," she said, and there was no bitterness in the statement, only clarity. "But I am not the same person who left." And the words settled into the space between them, not as a declaration, but as a simple truth that required no confirmation, and Alexander's gaze remained steady, his response quiet. "No, you are not," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke it, something that carried both acknowledgement and understanding, as if he had seen that transformation long before anyone else had noticed, and Evelyn allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, not for the past, not for the moment that had just passed, but for what lay ahead, for the life she had built without needing to look back to validate it. And somewhere far behind them, in a room that now felt smaller than it had hours ago, Daniel Brooks remained where the story had left him, still trying to understand the version of events he could no longer control, and Vanessa Clark stood beside him, her silence no longer passive, her perception sharpened by what she had witnessed, but none of it reached Evelyn anymore. None of it followed her into this space, because she had not walked away from them in anger. She had simply outgrown the place they existed in. And as she turned slightly from the window, her posture relaxed, her presence calm. There was no sense of ending, only continuation, only forward movement into something that no longer needed contrast to be defined, and the night outside stretched endlessly, quiet, certain, untouched by anything that had been left behind. And in that stillness, one truth remained, simple and unspoken. She did not come back for revenge. She came back already free.